Hello and welcome to Analysis with me, John Rees. Senior Ministry of Defence officials made a startling admission to the Guardian newspaper recently. They said that they believe that Britain's increasingly multicultural population is making it harder to gain popular support for large-scale military intervention abroad. This comes hard on the heels of an interview in which Robert Gates, former director of the CIA and an ex-Secretary of State for Defence, said that the UK no longer has the capacity to be a full military partner of the United States in future wars. All this follows the dramatic vote in the House of Commons last summer rejecting a military attack on Syria. This was seen by many as a turning point in British defence policy and as representative of current attitudes in British society towards foreign military intervention. So, is Britain war-weary, and is this multicultural population making it difficult for the government to demand unqualified loyalty? Joining me in the studio are Chris Ninan from the Stop the War Coalition, Taji Mustafa, spokesperson for Hizb ut-Tahrir, and Mohammed Abdullah, a community worker and ex-British military paramedic. And on the phone, we're joined by Paul Schultz, Senior Visiting Fellow at the Centre for Defence Studies, King's College London. And on the phone also, we're joined by Margaret Gilmore, who's a Senior Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. But first, let's catch up with this report.
The invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq a decade ago by NATO forces defined Western foreign policy in the early 2000s. At the time, many critics warned that such tactics would lead the West into a, quote, forever war, forever intervening in conflicts and sovereign nations around the world. But over a decade on, and following military operations largely deemed a failure, the Ministry of Defence has admitted that UK public opinion appears to have swung decisively against foreign intervention, and suggests that this is at least partly down to an increasingly multi-ethnic and multicultural society. In particular, they point to the intervention that never was in Syria, as personifying these deeper, long-term trends in British society. With Parliament defying the wishes of both the government and opposition in setting a time frame for military action, one opinion poll stated that 50% of people opposed any kind of tactical strike on Syria. Speaking before the vote in September, Foreign Affairs Committee member John Barron talked to the reasons why Parliament had doubts.
And don't forget, scepticism runs deep in Parliament at the moment. You know, we were told Saddam Hussein had WMD, we were told we'd be in and out of Helmand without firing a shot. Quite rightly, Parliament wants to ask key questions, look at the evidence, can these claims be verified, and then debate the consequences of going it alone without the UN, which is what Washington and London appears to want to do at the moment.
But sources close to the MOD stress that this change in attitude from Parliament and the general public does not rule out all overseas intervention in the future, but implies a move to more low-key air, naval and covert military operations. And have these invasions and occupations over the last decade united the British Muslim community against the idea of intervention? We spoke to Afzal Amin, former Muslim officer in the British Army, to get his view.
All the people that I've spoken to for the last sort of 15, 20 years, as I've been growing up here, and certainly the last 11 years that I was in the military, and certainly my role in counterinsurgency strategy, the people that I spoke to were from non-sort of traditional white Christian backgrounds in the UK, and certainly people who came from what we'd now call the Muslim world. There's a very, a great divergence of opinion, and within that, of course, there's people who are very much in favour of military action overseas. So Syria is a great example. The overwhelming vast majority of British Muslims that I've spoken to in the last few months are very much in favour of a Western-led military strike against the Syrian regime to stop the massacres that are occurring. I recently came back from a trip to southern Turkey where I met with the Syrian opposition prime minister and one of the senior members of the military council, as well as scores of refugees. And what became very clear is that there's a strong appetite amongst many Syrians that there is military action in Syria against the Assad regime. So the situation is not as simple as if you're this group, then you're in favour, and if you're that group, you're against. It's much more complex.
Nathaniel Amos Sansom, Islam Channel.
Well, Chris, do you think that this is a long-term shift in opinion, or do you think it's a blip that the government, hopes presumably it will get over and it will be back to sort of business as usual?
I think it probably is long-term, and I think the multiculturalism that the commentators are talking about is a factor, a major factor. The fact that there are people in Britain who have friends and experience and relatives in the countries that we were unfortunately attacking, no doubt had an impact on wider public opinion, but I actually think it runs more deep than that, and I think the experience of the wars themselves, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Afghanistan, is something that everyone in Britain knows about. They know it was a catastrophe. They know, as John Barron said, that our political elite lied to us in order to mobilise for those wars. And I think on top of that, people feel at a time when we're being told we have to cut back on the National Health Service, on education, on things people need in Britain, why on earth would we want to spend billions of pounds, because that's the kind of figures we're talking about, on killing people in foreign parts? I think there's been a real sea change for all those reasons, and I think it will be very difficult for the British government to participate in future wars, and the setback over Syria was a serious one for them.
Mohammed, I mean, you were somebody who joined the military and then left over this kind of issue. So in some ways, you were at the sharp end, but also representative of this trend in British society. What was it that happened to you, and why did you take the decision you did?
Well, John, this was probably the first time that I'm actually speaking about it on the national level. It's something that I'm not very happy to talk about, but it has to be known from my perspective. Otherwise, you probably won't be getting many opinions of Muslim soldiers or soldiers from a certain background who hold dearly to a belief and not actually able to express it in a soldiering role. And I was very naive at the time. I joined the military. I wanted an experience. I wanted to see adventure. I wanted to protect my country and defend it. But maybe joining the military at that time wasn't right for me, even though I wanted to become a paramedic. The experiences from that have made me wonder, are we really going to fight a war in order to defend our country? Or were we going for another reason? And ultimately, that reason wasn't a reason that was formed by a national consensus. It was formed from the higher echelons into the society. And we're talking about the government of the time then, in 2003, when I left, was Tony Blair's government, whom I used to admire as a young school student. I used to mimic him, but it's a shame that in how Tony Blair is seen today as masquerading around the Middle East as some form of a peace envoy. It really makes me now reflect on how can a Muslim engage with the military again, because quite frankly there are not a lot of Muslims in that role compared to other professions such as lawyers and doctors and so forth. So there is a very strong sticking issue here for why are Muslims not joining the military. There are underlying issues, and they ought to be tackled and addressed and taught from top down, as Colonel Tim Collins once did on the Iraqi battlefield, mentioning that when troops are going into Iraq, they're not going for a picnic, but to go and tread lightly upon the Iraqi earth. And also from the bottom down, how can we, as Muslims and other faith minorities, influence the army in order to progress and to be more inclusive?
Let me bring Margaret Gilmore in. Margaret, how fundamental a shift do you think there is? Because today David Cameron's actually being questioned by a Commons committee about the Strategic Defence Review, and one MP said to him, look, if you ask people in this country what's more important, Hamas or flooding, they're going to say flooding?
I totally agree with you, but I don't think the shifts are necessarily that simple. I mean, I do think that people are war weary, and I think they have been for a decade. I don't think it's to do with diversity. I think it's right across the board. I think we're talking about British people are war weary, whatever their backgrounds. In the main, there are some complexities over people wanting to go and fight in Syria and what have you, but I think that's more complex. But I think the taxpayers don't want their money spent, as your first speaker in the studio said, they don't want their money spent on defence when it could be spent on flood defences, as it were, or on education or on health. But I think, is David Cameron responding to the people? Is he responding to the economic climate? Or are we in a situation where there isn't a war that we should be fighting?
Those are interesting questions. Tashi, I mean, one point that Margaret made is right, though. I mean, we know that there was a very high proportion of Muslims who were opposed to the war, but there was pretty much a high proportion of everybody that was opposed to the war. So the MOD kind of pointing to multiculturalism can only be part of the story, can't it?
I think it is part of the story, and I think anybody getting carried away to think that the British establishment, I make a distinction here between the wider masses on the streets who are war-weary, and there's an establishment that makes the case for war, that dispatches the masses to go to war. Britain has a colonial history. This is a sad reality. It sees the Muslim world, largely the Middle East, as a place for to seek political influence, economic advantage, resources, cheap oil, etc. With that mindset, it is not surprising that there are many pretexts for going to war. But to justify to the masses who will do the fighting, you have to give them some reason. So they said humanitarianism, they talked about saving the Afghan woman, etc., etc. And I think what's happening over time is not only are people war-weary, but these reasons don't stack up. People are saying these are utter rubbish. So I would say there shouldn't be dancing that the UK government, I think these are more, as Margaret Gilmore said, economic realities. There isn't a lot of money in the kitty, but they've made it clear that they may use drones more, they may use the Air Force more, so that people whose sons come home in body bags, who naturally will feel that emotional hurt, won't question the government. So until the leopards changes its skins, which I can't see, it's been a capitalist government that looks for the interest of a minority of few big businesses, there isn't a fundamental change as I see.
Well, we'll be coming on to some of the questions around the sort of defence strategy moving forward in the second half of the programme. But before we get to that, Paul Schultz, let me just ask you: did you think that this is the kind of statement that you're getting out of the MOD now? Do you think this is a heartfelt analysis? Or do you think that this is kind of pushback against cuts in defence spending?
I think it's an acknowledgement of a reality, but it's not just about feelings inside the UK. The reason that the British public have become sceptical about the kind of wars we've been involved in, and they are different. It's misleading to talk about one war. It's not one war. It's different choices. It's misleading to talk about the masses. It isn't masses. It's a small professional army, the smallest since the Napoleonic Wars. So we need to be clear what we're talking about. But the point is those campaigns have not gone as expected. So the form of war that has been attempted over the last 10 or 12 years, which I think actually has been quite idealistic. Some people have described it as armed social work. It's not been about capitalist exploitation. I mean, what possible financial motive have we got for being involved in Iraq or Afghanistan? But that has been frustrated. We've met forms of resistance which have been murderously destructive for the people of Iraq and Afghanistan. The vast majority of people in those countries who died there have died from deliberate, indiscriminate killing by insurgents. So, but this has crippled the attempt to reconstruct those countries, to give them a further chance. Something has been achieved, but far less than was expected. And so, from that point of view, this isn't a form of war that will be attempted again, I think.
Okay. So I put some of those points to Margaret Gilmore a moment. Margaret, do you think that there was no economic interest in say, the Iraq War?
I don't quite know what you... Oh, I see what you mean, yeah, the economic side of things. I think there may have been an element of that at the time, but we've gone way beyond all of that. And I think nowadays it's absolutely crystal clear that us getting involved in wars in the Middle East, for example, are not going to do much for the UK. They're not going to give us greater influence. Our influence globally is definitely diminishing, and there aren't really big economic gains to be made, and we can't afford it. And goodness knows what would happen if we start intervening. You get this ripple effect where the war here ends up with a war there. So it's not working for us, and us going in at the moment, certainly to Syria, would I can't see any particular benefits.
Okay, just before we move to the break, let me just bring Mohammed back in. Do you think that the troops at the time felt that they were being sent to war, you know, as Paul described it, as kind of armed social work, when actually the real purpose was something else? Did they sense that there was something wrong in the politicians' arguments?
Well, most of the troops will hold to the order that one should not disobey them, but there are those who would keep their conscience up high and that's the position that I had taken at the time, not to go and just be trained to actually stick a bayonet into an Iraqi soldier. That was not my ideal of being a soldier and protecting my country. Okay, it's one of the duties to be trained to kill, but it's also a duty to protect one's country as well. And weighing those two up, most soldiers would want to protect their country, and they will follow the orders. If there were any objections to that, then there are severe consequences to that.
Anyway, just let me stop you there. Chris, what do you think about this? I mean, what was the balance between kind of economic interest and other causes in the wars of the last decade, do you think?
Well, I mean, I fundamentally disagree with Paul, actually. I mean, and funnily enough, I think this is also the key to the whole question of public opinion. I think what people realised, even running up to the Iraq War and certainly after it, was that these wars were not being fought for humanitarian reasons, for democratic reasons, even as a sensible response to 9/11. That actually these wars were being fought to pursue the big business and geopolitical interests of the US elites, and that expressed itself in the popular imagination in the phrase "this is a war for oil," and I think that it was precisely that recognition that not only were we being lied to, not only were we causing massive destruction and murder, but we were doing it in the interests of big business that led to the kind of sense of revulsion of these wars. So, I mean, I think A, they were about economic interests, and B, this is the key to understanding why the people in Britain have turned against them fundamentally.
OK, well, that brings us to the end of part one of this, but we'll be dealing with some of the more strategic aspects of the defence review that's going on and some of the criticisms of the wars of the last decade or so. So do rejoin us after the break for part two of analysis.